Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming along tonight. Welcome to Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre Live. I'm David E. Neville, and tonight I'm joined by Kim Millar, who has written Mr. Moonlight, a new play about the legendary entertainer Frankie Vaughan. It opens at Glasgow's Lunchtime Theatre, a play a pint at Oran Mor next week. I'll be asking Kim all about the play shortly. I've also pre-recorded interviews with the play's director, April Chamberlain, and the actor Andy Clark, who will be playing Frankie Vaughan. So, technology willing, we'll come to them later. Kim Millar is a writer and storyliner who's worked on Coronation Street, Hollyoaks, Waterloo Road, Casualty, Doctors, and River City, and many other television programs. Good evening, Kim, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, many of you, I'm sure, will know and remember Frankie Vaughan, but for anyone who doesn't, who was he? He threw out a leg, chuckled in the middle of a song, made love to Marilyn Monroe on screen, and at one time was Britain's most successful popular entertainer. Like few others in his walk of life, Frankie Vaughan was loved for himself as well as for his talent. So wrote Michael Friedland in The Guardian in September 1999, when he wrote Frankie Vaughan's obituary. Frankie Vaughan was born Frank from Abelson in Liverpool on 3rd of February 1928. He came from a family of Russian Jewish descent. He took his stage surname from his grandmother. He was her first grandson, and she called him Frank, my number one. Only she said it in her Russian accent, and it sounded more like Frank, my number one, Vaughan. I'll do that again. Frank, my number one. Now, I should be able to do this because my grandmother was Russian as well. So that's a little bit about the background about Frankie Vaughan. Kim, your play is set in and focuses on a period when Frankie spent a lot of time in Glasgow. Can you tell us what the play's about and how you got involved in writing it?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'd worked with the director, April Chamberlain, before on my previous play, which was an idea that kind of sprung up fully formed, and we worked well together. We enjoyed working together, and April said to me, I would like you to have a think about this. And she had a newspaper cutting, and it was about Frank and the Easter House gangs. And I was aware of his involvement in them, and I'd seen the article before, and I started doing a bit of research into it. The challenge that we had really was, how do you dramatize gang culture and his involvement in it? And I think I came at it from a erroneous point of view in the first instance, which was, make it a bit West Side Story, two gangs, one against the other. But actually, with the constraints of Oran Mor, as you know, David, you've got 3 characters, you've got 1 hour. How can you possibly tell such a story in that kind of framework? So as I did more research into Frank, I began to uncover not just about the man, but about his connection to Glasgow. And it was watching an interview that he did on This Morning. I think it must have been in the early 90s. And he was talking about how he had a throat infection and how he croaked on stage in the Barrowlands, and how the audience had sung his songs back to him. And he felt, I think his exact words were, any other city in the world, I would have been booed off the stage and had bottles thrown at me. But only in Glasgow could that happen. And he had a real affinity for the city. And then I found out that he had found the sheet music for Give Me the Moonlight in Bigger's music shop just off Sauchiehall Street. And yeah, it was a Victorian song which had been performed by a comedian who died in sort of like 1938. So it was an obscure song which he obviously took and made his own. It became his biggest hit. So these 2 facts were kind of going around my head. And then there was the whole knife culture thing. And at the time, knife violence in London and Wales, London in particular, but England generally, was going up, rocketing up. And it was something that we had managed to get over, I suppose, mitigating factors with, since 2005, 2006, it's been on the decrease, but England and Wales are seeing a big surge in it just now. And it just seemed incredible to me that we should still be talking about the same things that he was talking about, 40 years ago. So, yeah, instead of making it about gangs, I thought the best, most manageable way to do it would be to take my own concerns as a mother to a young, teenage son, and try and dramatise that, and that the issues are still the same. Glasgow's still a very violent city, whether we like it or not. There is that undercurrent of violence, and especially with young men. So that was how the play came about. It's basically about Walter, who is a 17-year-old boy from Easterhouse, can't get a leg up because of where he comes from, because of the lack of opportunity that there is there. And his mum, Anne, is a cleaner in the Barrowland ballrooms, and she's managed to get him a job off of her connection with the manager. And he immediately connects with Frankie, because Frankie's own background was very similar. And then you have the whole kind of play out of sort of like a mini crisis of confidence for Frank, which Anne, in a kind of role of surrogate grandmother, because as you said, Frank was very much brought up by his grandmother and very influenced by her. She brings him out of this kind of mini crisis of confidence, and in not exactly recompense, but because he recognises so much of himself in her son, he makes a pledge to come back and help, and he does that, and he does it for many years. So that's a very long-winded way of telling you what the stage is about. It's about a mother's fear for her son and a man at the peak of his powers and fame finding a similarity in his youthful self with this young, wayward teenager.
Thank you. It sounds a very concise way of telling a story about a bigger picture, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, which is always best done through the personal, because you couldn't possibly take on all the social issues and the intricacies and the nuance of the kind of cultural state that leads young men into these gangs. So doing it through the personal seemed to me like the best kind of shorthand of getting that across.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of things did you find out about Frankie as a young man when you were doing your research? I mean, I know that he was looked after by his grandmother, not because his parents abandoned him or anything like that, but no, they were very hardworking. His father was an upholsterer and his mother, I think, was a seamstress. Is that right?
I think so, yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah.
So they were working all hours.
Yeah, it was very much that, his parents were real grafters, and there were people who had to work probably about 5 times harder than anybody else did, because nobody was employing Jewish immigrants at that time, and every opportunity was taken and grabbed with both hands, as his grandmother said. I think he says it in the play, if you want to do something, do it with both hands, because they had nothing, and everything that they had to work extremely hard for, and they were trying to make a living in a country that wasn't native. And I think his grandmother had a particularly hard time of it and was left with, I think it was 2 young children when she came over here. So yeah, I really feel, looking around some parts of the city, you see the same thing happening over and over again. You see the people who are grasping the opportunities and really making the most of every opportunity that they're handed. And that was the feeling that Frank kind of gave me, was that this was somebody who would just graft and graft and graft to support their family, and had real talent, but also the way he conducted himself made him extremely employable, and everybody wanted to work with him. And I've never read so much about somebody who was just adored by everyone who he crossed paths with, and he had a real generosity of spirit, and I think that comes across in his interviews and certainly in his performance. A man with good values, moral integrity, and a real work ethic.
Mm. He the story seems to go that he was a bit of a tearaway, mm-hmm. and he got involved in the youth club and got an interest in boxing.
Yeah,
and he did pretty well with boxing, I believe.
Yeah, he did. I mean, I think he felt, like a bit different at school, looked different to everybody else, came from a different background to everyone else, and fell in with a bad crowd in order to fit in. But then, got pulled up and sent to this, I think they called it a correctional boys club. But he said that that was the best thing that had happened to him, because all of a sudden it gave him a focus for all his energies and made him realise that, you know, everything in life was a choice and you could make good choices or bad choices. So yeah, I think he was an excellent boxer. Certainly Andy, who is playing Frankie, had got all these old, you know, the fanzines from eBay, sort of round about the 1960s, and it was kind of Frankie Vaughan in his own words, and it's all these beautiful pictures of Frankie working out and Frankie boxing, and then Frankie at home with his family. And yeah, I mean, God, he's a physically fit guy. I mean, really, really fit. And he did see in the research, I discovered that he said, you know, if I hadn't found an outlet in boxing, it gave me the confidence to think that I could probably do anything if I set my mind to it, because I would never have thought I could have done that. And you just need confidence in life to make the most of any opportunity that comes your way, which, you know, it was great, and that kind of informed his relationship with Walter in the play.
Yeah, and of course, the play's obviously very relevant to what's happening today, you know, particularly the tragic thing about knife crime. Do you think it really is the sort of lack of facilities for young people, lack of outlets, that is one of the main problems? I mean, poverty, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's a lack of understanding of why people are drawn to these gangs and what happens to them once they're in them, and how difficult it is to then escape them, and how a much more holistic approach is the only way forward. And I think that's what, you know, when the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit came into being around about 2005, 2006, it was a holistic approach. It was looking at things like education, it was looking at housing, it was looking at infrastructure and facilities and what there was for young people. And it took a kind of, they imposed more serious penalties on people who were caught knife carrying, but it was with the involvement of the police. They called in people they thought were likely to offend and said, okay, this is the way your life is going to be if you continue down this path. This is what's going to happen to you, and here's a different route. And, you know, I think, you know, we were doing that in 2005 and 2006, and it's proven to be effective. You know, knife crime has reduced drastically. And I think that's actually what Frank was trying to do in 1968 when he came out. He was looking at everything that was wrong with Easter House, with these gangs, with all the things that were missing in these kids' lives, and trying to give them something that would fill up those gaps that weren't there, that had been taken away from them when they were like carted off into these estates. So I think he was well ahead of the game. He understood more than the police did that a holistic approach was what was needed at that stage. And that now has proven, you know, Scotland, England and Wales are looking to Scotland now in terms of how to reduce knife crime. They've got different sets of issues than we've got here, but you know, I mean, there's a way to go still, obviously, David, but you know, it's been an exemplary kind of a decrease. But yeah, I think he was well ahead of the game.
He was, yeah. And I think for everybody watching, if you do go on YouTube, you may well be able to find some newsreel of Frankie when he came to Glasgow. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about it is, you know, he doesn't just stand around making speeches. He actually gets in amongst all the young people and talk to them. And you can see him doing that on several occasions. And he's not got what a lot of stars nowadays would have, which is like bodyguards or anything like that. He is there, he's in amongst them, and he's talking quite tough with them. And I think, referring to his physique, actually they probably saw that it's quite a, you know, he's maybe not someone to take on. But he seemed to have a real sort of charisma about him, which, you know, perhaps really helped in that situation. I think what we'll do now is we'll play the interview with April. April Chamberlain is directing the play, and of course for Oran Mor they only have 2 weeks rehearsal, so they started last week and they're in second week this week. So I guess April's pretty busy, otherwise she would have joined us tonight. But I managed to catch up with her last week, and Janet, if you wouldn't mind queuing up the video, and Apologies for the quality, but we did it on Zoom, and as you will see, the picture's not as good as maybe the picture we've got here, but this is April Chamberlain.
I actually heard an interview with somebody about a programme that was on Radio Scotland, and then listened to the programme, and it was about Frankie coming to Glasgow in the 60s and the things he did here in the city and the effect of his arrival and the boys' clubs and everything. And I just always thought it was a great idea, and I love the notion that this very kind of glamorous Hollywood movie star singer would appear in Glasgow and would take a cause like Easter House to heart, you know, and I just thought it was a lovely story, and had a sort of, you know, it was glamorous and interesting, and obviously he was a lovely singer as well, so it had songs, and I just always thought it would make a good wee play.
Did you always think of it as a play with songs, as a musical?
Well, I did, because I enjoy a musical, and I like the songs of that era. And because when I was growing up, I can remember my mum and dad used to have that sort of music going. You know, my dad was a trumpet player and played in bands, and you know, in the around that time and before then. And so I think that was, you know, those were the sort of some of the influences, some of the musical influences in our family as I was growing up. So I think I thought, oh, why not?
Did you have particular memories of, you know, the late 60s in Glasgow, when, you know, there was a lot of, you know, gang troubles?
I arrived in Glasgow in the 70s, in the late 70s, so I was about 10 years too late. So I didn't have memories of that time, but obviously at the point that I arrived in 1977, that was a very close memory, you know, and a very near memory for a lot of people. And, you know, when I said to people in London, where I was born and brought up, that I was, you know, moving to Scotland, they'd say, oh, that's lovely, where are you going? And I'd said Glasgow, and they would sort of, you know, look at sort of, oh, that's a bit of a shame, you know, because at that time the reputation was still very, you know, still that was very much the culture, and obviously it's changed so much, and you know, so incredibly, but that time there was still that feeling that it was, those things weren't very far in the past. So I certainly heard a lot about it.
Yeah, I think I seem to remember at that time there was a, you know, feeling in Glasgow that always kind of was in the news, you know, particularly down south, and it wasn't entirely what Glasgow was about.
No, it wasn't. It was very unfair, and to a certain extent, it still is. You know, and it's a narrative that is often used about Glasgow, and it's very unfair on its people as well. But you know, these things take a long time to change.
I suppose, you know, Frankie Vaughan, he gave quite a confidence boost to Easter House and some of the kids there. Is that something you really felt when you began researching and working on the play?
He came into a situation which was obviously a very, you know, dark situation, but then of course he could relate to that because he understood that those feelings of being an outsider, because he was from an immigrant family, and so that was actually, you know, he knew what it was like to not fit in, or to, you know, and to live in a not good area, if you like, you know, a sort of more troubled area, and so I think he could actually relate to that. So I loved that image of this sort of, very handsome, suave, attractive movie star, lovely singer. And yet actually, I thought that, his commitment to Easter House and his commitment to trying to help those, with those clubs and to develop a better series of pastimes for the kids to get engaged with, rather than gang related stuff, was such a brilliant thing to try and do. And the fact that he did that and people remember him for that here is, I think, is a wonderful story.
For you as a director, choosing to work on and produce a play about such a well-known person, what are the challenges?
Well, I suppose the first challenge is to get somebody who you feel is a good Frankie, somebody who can take that on, because it's quite very big shoes to fill. But I knew as soon as I knew we were doing it, I absolutely knew that I wanted Andy Clark, and I was just so thrilled when he could do it, because I just knew he would be brilliant. I've long admired him as an actor anyway, and have seen him in so many things over the years, and I thought he was just the right age for the period that we were talking about in Glasgow. And he's very musical, he's a lovely voice, and so I was absolutely delighted when he could do it, because I thought that, although I do also think it's important just to not just try and absolutely replicate somebody, because you don't want to be so restrictive, but at the same time I felt there was a kind of essence of Frankie that I really wanted us to get, and I just knew that Andy was right in so many ways, and I think that's what he does get.
And in a few minutes we'll come to Andy Clark, who's playing Frankie Vaughan. And Kim, this production hasn't been without its challenges, not least because of the lockdown and COVID. And I believe this is the third attempt to get the production on. But even in the first week of rehearsals, I believe there were one or two problems.
Yeah. Craig arrived a week past yesterday in rehearsal with a leg brace and crutches, and he was adamant. He was perfectly fine singing and dancing and pulling knives and everything, but he had a really serious injury. He had done his cruciate ligament, although he wasn't completely sure what he'd done at that point. So yeah, we have had our challenges, and this is the third time, and we thought there's nothing else that can possibly go wrong. But yeah, it has morphed quite a lot, though. The actual play's morphed between the first version of it and the final version of it's changed quite drastically. One of the major changes being that after I met Craig at the read through last October, I made his part much bigger because he was so good.
So what was Craig's second name? Sorry?
McLean.
Craig.
So yeah, we had expanded his part and changed the structure quite a lot to involve the character of Walter much more, and yeah, then he wasn't able to do it, and I think he was really, really disappointed. I hope we get to work together in the future.
But another actor who stepped in.
Yes, Kyle Gardner, who is from Easter House himself, and he's jumped right in literally at the deep end and is swimming admirably. So I think April's quite delighted. I'm going to see them in rehearsal, I think, on Thursday. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay.
Yeah, it will definitely go on this time.
Well, I'm sure it will. And Janet, if you're getting ready with Andy's interview, I caught up with Andy last Monday night, I think it was, first day of the new rehearsals. And unfortunately, Andy had quite a thick cold, but he assured me that he's going to be okay. And in the acting game, you have to be. So if you're ready, Janet. I guess the first thing I want to ask you is what interested you in taking on this role and this play?
Hi, David. I'd heard of Frankie Vaughan, and I'd heard of the story of when he came to Glasgow and his experiences with the gang culture in Easterhouse and stuff. So I knew of it. So when I was asked to if I could play Frankie Vaughan, my interest was piqued, because first I had to find out whether I could play it myself, and I thought, well, I'm never going to be James Dean or anybody like that. So Frankie Vaughan was roughly my age at the time of this story, and both got enough. I thought I had enough hair to play him, so and I could just about carry a tune. And as I say, it's not specifically the beginning, middle, and end of Frankie Vaughan's story. It's more about a specific thing that happened in his life, and being from living in Glasgow for the last 20 years. It was a story that I was interested in.
So you weren't that aware of him as an entertainer?
I remember seeing him on Working with Wise, so I knew his name. I knew the name Frankie Vaughan. I think some people get mixed up. There's lots of Frankies and Frankie Valley and all these different Frankies, but when I looked up Frankie Vaughan, I remembered him from a sketch on Morecambe and Wise. But when you speak to people about Frankie Vaughan, a lot of people say, "Oh, my mum loved him, my granny loved him." And I said to somebody the weekend that I was doing a thing about Frankie Vaughan, and it was like, "Oh, everybody's granny loved him, and everybody's mum loved him." So I knew of him, his name, and I knew that I knew bits and bobs about him. So it wasn't until I took the play on that I started to learn a wee bit more about him.
Was there anything that surprised you, or what did you discover?
Yeah. Well, I didn't go to Robert De Niro like that. What I did was I did find as much. There's not a lot about Frankie Vaughan. I don't think there's any books about him. There's no biographies, but there's a couple of really good documentaries about him online, and a couple of interviews, and there's not many of his films. Actually, he didn't do many films. He did about 4 or 5, but there's a couple of his films that I watched. And what I think I found out about him is that he was, universally liked by a generation of people, and that he seemed to manage to get through those generations unscathed, in terms of, like, he might have waned in popularity slightly, but he still maintained its core audience, that he was like a proper heartthrob in the 50s, and he was like the next British singing sensation. And then he sort of went to America, and he decided it wasn't for him, and he came back, but he maintained enough popularity to continue to work, and right up till his till very late in his life he was working, and he seemed to have this universal popularity, and he didn't become kitsch or a cult figure or naff, or he did have a genuine talent, but he wasn't like a massive superstar. Like, he didn't, like Frank Sinatra or Tom Jones or something like that, but he was, I think, had he wanted to be, he probably could have done. But I mean, by his own admission, he decided that Hollywood wasn't for him, and he said it was the first time that he broke a contract. He went to Hollywood, and he made 2 or 3 films, and he was at a party one night, and he looked across at Stella, his wife, and she was surrounded by beautiful men. He was surrounded by beautiful girls, and he just thought, there's something not right here. So they came home. So he did sacrifice I think he could have been a huge star in America.
That's an aspect of his character. His values seem to be pretty high, of family, community.
I think so. I think I'd be careful not to deify him, but I do think that, I don't think he had a dark side, or I'm sure, he didn't, a lot of these fantastically successful, well-known entertainers, actors, singers do have a dark side, or that they might have manic depression, or they may be alcoholics, or this or that. I think Frankie Vaughan was a very genuine person, and I think, as you say, he did have a deep sense of values, and I don't think it was for show. I think it was all genuine. And I think what I found out about him was he came from like a very difficult upbringing in Liverpool. And he, at one point when he's getting interviewed, he talks about getting sent to like a boys' club to sort him out because he was like a delinquent. And he sort of refers to when he says, I used to talk like that. So like he was a proper little Liverpudlian tearaway by all accounts. And it really sorted him out. And then he got into singing, and he got into boxing, and almost from a very young age. I've got a fantastic sort of, it's not like a book, it's like a magazine about him. And it's sort of from the 50s at the very beginning of his career. And even at the very beginning of his career, he's immediately helping boys start clubs, and he's going back to boys' clubs, and he's helping kids that were in his position right from the beginning. So it's not like something he did later in life or something he just did once a year. And I believe it was all genuine. And that's why I think the stuff when he did come to Glasgow and he was mocked for it. I think there's a Matt McGinn song that's all very tongue in cheek about Frankie Vaughan coming to Glasgow and Frankie Vaughan, Giza Hon and all that. But I believe it was utterly genuine that he wasn't doing it for publicity. He wasn't doing it. I think he had genuine altruistic motives, and he stayed very true to his roots.
So tell me about portraying him. I mean, I know you're a very versatile actor and musician and singer, but here you are playing a well-known character.
Yeah. The challenge is that I think he's got a great voice, a brilliant voice. It's not necessarily distinct to you. It's not like, I'm not like doing an impression of him. I've got the cold at the moment as well, so I've just sort of started rehearsals again, so it's a bit tricky singing. But he just had amazing charisma and amazing energy. So, I mean, it's like an amazing sincerity. And, I think the key to it is sincerity. And if you can fake that, you're laughing. That's an old music hall gag. But there's footage of him in one of his first films where he does a routine in the middle of it. It's just, it's dead simple, but it's just like, he's got such presence, and he's so watchable. So, I can't worry too much about that. I just have to sort of try and, emulate like that as best as I can. But also, it's later in his career, well, it's the late 60s where he's sort of gone through being the sort of matinee idol, where he's in his 40s, he's in his mid-40s, and he's become more of a sort of cabaret singer, but not like a sort of, a lounge singer. He's still, playing big theatres, and he's still doing a big show. And he's so, for somebody who was brought up in a sort of, in difficult circumstances and came from nothing, essentially came from nothing. I also don't think he's particularly garish, like, the way that some stars, even, working class stars like, like Liberace, and they've got this opulence. I don't think he was opulent. I think, he enjoyed the finer things in life, but he had dignity, he had class. And that's what I see from him, is that how he just kind of oozes this natural class and dignity. So I need to find that for somewhere.
I'm sure Andy will do you proud, Kim. It's interesting what he said about Frankie Vaughan having class, and which is interesting. I read something about how, when he first started performing on main stages, he got a lot of advice from older entertainers. I think Hetty King, and then I saw something the other day with Jimmy Tarbuck. They worked together a lot, I think on the Moss Empire circuit, and he was saying that how Frankie Vaughan learned how to dress really well and carry himself really well. And I wonder if that's what took him to Hollywood, because he had such a presence. And do you know much about that side of his life?
His Hollywood career, there isn't much about it really. I know that I think he was unhappy when he was there, from what I gather. And yeah, he just said it wasn't for me. Just wasn't. I just wanted to have my normal family life, and I think that was something that he felt maybe wasn't conducive to LA pool parties with all the big stars and everything. And Marilyn Monroe allegedly, tried to seduce him on various occasions, and he had to kind of batter off. But yeah, I think, you know, I think he was probably, as Andy said, for all, you know, he was this glamorous star. He was probably quite, you know, a man of simple, if good taste. And yeah, you know, it's not for everyone. But there isn't very
Yeah.
much written about that aspect of his career, David. You know, it gets harder as his career kind of progresses to get more info.
And you told me when we met a while ago about when you worked for the Evening Times, and
Yes.
one
Oh
of your
yeah.
colleagues,
Yes.
a photographer, spent a lot of time with
Yeah.
Frankie when he was in London. Was it when he was in Glasgow, rather?
Yeah. The Evening Times used to do these things called shopping tours, which I had no idea they even existed. But I had I've been looking through old footage of Frankie at Easterhouse, and I recognised Alistair Starrs, who was the picture editor when I worked there. And he's my friend on Facebook, although he lives in Tenerife now, so I couldn't meet him face to face. But I was messaging him back and forward, and he had been one of the drivers conducting these shopping tours. And basically, when a VIP came to town, the Evening Times would take them around the city, show them the sights, take them to whatever shops they wanted to go to, and yeah, just kind of be like a host for the day before they went off to do their gig at night. And Al Starrs told me that he was a complete gentleman. He liked his White and Mackay whiskey very much, to the point where Alistair's disappeared from the back seat of the car he was being driven around in. He said he was a great guy, absolutely decent. Had a real feel for the city and a real love for the city. And he dropped him off at the end of the day at the White House Hotel, which I think was a kind of, you know, hotel round in just, is it round Queen Margaret Drive? I don't think it's a hotel anymore, but it was certainly the poshest hotel of the time. Yeah, and yeah, Al was there. Cigarette in his mouth, camera in one hand, taking pictures of Frankie at Easterhouse. And yeah, he said there was a real buzz about the whole thing, a feeling of excitement that this massive star was actually on their home turf, and everybody wanted to see him and be close to him. And he was extremely eloquent and generous in the way he behaved towards everybody. Yeah, and had a real understanding of what these kids had to contend with.
Kim, you've written a lot for serials and television,
Mhm.
and in these serials, you work to set characters, and often you have to follow or develop existing storylines. How different is that from working on something like this play, which is very much an original play?
I was thinking about this, and I think the main difference is, you know, there's certain things when you're working in serial continuous drama, there are always elements of serial which you have to pick up and you have to leave off because it's part of a much bigger machine. There's certain things that you cannot change. And the joy of this was when we had the first read through last October, I realised that there was far too much talking. It was too much of a two-hander. It was slow paced, and I didn't get that reading it off the page. And it was only when I actually heard Andy and Karen and Craig reading it out, I realised I had to get something that was much more visual and much more action-based. And the joy of it being your own kind of thing is you can actually just go, actually, I'm scrapping that and starting again. Whereas in a serial drama, you can't, because, you know, it might not be working, but because you are part of a much bigger machine, you can't say, actually, no, I want to do it this way. So that's a bit of a joy, really, is just being able to rewrite when you want to, within reason. I was still rewriting when we were on the second rehearsal week last time. So yeah, because you hear people speaking the words and you realise actually that's the same as that. There's a far more concise way of saying this. They don't need to say that at all. Cut, to the point where I think April was getting a bit annoyed at me because I was kind of, we could do without this line, we could do without that line. She's just like, no, just stop. So yeah, it becomes it's a real joy, actually. And something like Oran Mor is, you know, where could you ever get the chance to see something that you've written performed like that by such brilliant actors? You just don't get these opportunities in television very much.
Yes, and again, for anyone that doesn't know about Glasgow's Lunchtime Theatre, they have a weekly turnaround of plays, and seasons that last for about 14 weeks. They do, I think it's up to 40 plays a year. So it's quite fast and furious, but it really does give writers a chance to get their work out there, and also bringing on newer actors into the business as well and giving them a chance. But part of the challenge is you have 2 weeks rehearsal, and there are 2 designers that work this season, so they're on this constant turnaround. So it is fast, but there's something very, very good about that as well, I think.
Absolutely, and you know, it gives so many people opportunities, and it's really entertaining, you know, and there's such a diverse kind of range of subject matter. You know, you just don't know really what you're going to get, and it's great, isn't it? Because otherwise, Netflix.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, look, thank you very much, Kim, for
Thank
taking the
you.
time to do this interview. And if anyone does have the opportunity to go and see the play, it's on from the 25th to the 30th of April at 1 o'clock at Glasgow's Lunchtime Theatre, A Play, a Pie and a Pint at Oran Mor, which is on the corner of Great Western Road and Byres Road. So thank you again.